I never imagined that the same family who laughed at my little hobby would one day be sitting in my living room asking me for a loan. I still remember the exact moment it started to unravel. It was Thanksgiving, my favorite holiday, the one time of year I actually looked forward to being around my family, even though every year gave me a fresh reason not to. I walked in carrying a tray of cupcakes I'd decorated myself, little pumpkins with piped orange frosting and tiny fondant stems, the kind of thing I sold out of my kitchen for extra cash. My sister Denise took one look at the tray and laughed so hard she had to put her wine glass down on the counter. "Oh my God, Callie's still doing the cupcake thing," she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "When are you going to get a real job, sweetie?" I forced a smile. I always forced a smile. That was the family currency. Swallow it, laugh along, don't make it weird. My mother didn't even look up from the turkey she was carving. She just said, "Well, not everyone can be like your brother," and that was that. Conversation over. Subject changed. Like I hadn't spent the last 4 months building something from nothing at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning after my shift at the diner. I set the tray down at the end of the table, near the kids section, where Denise's stepson was already reaching for one before anyone had said grace. My father glanced at the cupcakes, then at me, and gave me the same tight, distracted nod he gave the mailman. Not unkind, just absent, like I was furniture that occasionally spoke. I didn't say anything back. I never did. That was always my problem. Or maybe it was my strength. I hadn't figured out which yet. What none of them knew, what I hadn't told a single soul in that house, was that 3 days earlier, a woman named Patricia Voss had reached out to me. She ran procurement for a chain of boutique hotels along the East Coast, and she wanted to talk about carrying my cupcakes, not as a one-off, but as a standing wholesale account. 12 locations. I hadn't said yes yet. I hadn't said anything yet. I was terrified to even let myself hope. I'd read her email so many times in the bathroom of the diner where I worked that I'd practically memorized the punctuation. So I sat there at that table, eating cold mashed potatoes because my mother always cleared the good dishes to the kitchen the second dinner started, listening to my brother Trent talk about how his leadership retreat for a company he'd work at for maybe 8 more months before getting bored and quitting. Same as the last 2 jobs. Everyone nodded along like he was describing a promotion to CEO. My father even said, "That's my boy," and reached over to squeeze his shoulder. I just smiled, and I thought about Patricia's email sitting unanswered in my inbox. And I thought, you have no idea what's coming. I want to be clear, I wasn't naive. I knew my family looked down on me. I'd known it since I was 12 years old, and my mother introduced me to a neighbor as my other daughter. She likes to bake, while introducing Denise as our future lawyer, even though Denise was only ever a paralegal and never once mentioned law school. I grew up in the shadow of 2 siblings who were, by every visible metric, doing better than me. Denise had her paralegal certificate and a fiancé with a nice truck and a habit of talking about their upcoming wedding like it was a merger. Trent had a business degree, a girlfriend who posted about their vacations, and a talent for sounding successful without ever quite being anything. And I had a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, a job refilling ketchup bottles at a diner, and a side hustle my family treated like a phase I'd eventually grow out of, the way you grow out of a phase of wanting to be a veterinarian. The truth is, I loved baking before I loved anything else. My grandmother taught me when I was 7, standing on a step stool in her kitchen in Ohio, flour on my nose, learning that butter had to be cold and patience had to be endless. She used to hum while she worked, old songs I never learned the names of, and she'd let me lick the spoon even after the doctor told her not to let me eat raw eggs. She used to say that baking was the one place where doing things right always paid off, no exceptions, no politics, no favorites. I believed her, I still do. After she passed when I was 19, baking became the only thing that made sense to me. I started selling cupcakes at the farmer's market on weekends, setting up a folding table with a checkered cloth my grandmother used to use for picnics. Then I started taking custom orders, birthdays, baby showers, a divorce party once, which taught me that grief and celebration taste almost the same in frosting form. Then I built a website with money I didn't really have, teaching myself the whole thing from tutorials at midnight because I couldn't afford to pay someone else to do it. My mother called it cute. My father, when he spoke at all, called it a nice little thing to do until you figure out what you actually want to do with your life. I was 26 years old, and my parents still talked about my life's work like it was a summer camp art project I'd bring home in a manila folder. Dinner rolled on the way it always did. My Aunt Carol asked me, not unkindly but not really caring either, if I was still doing the baking stuff, in the same tone she might ask if I was still seeing a therapist. Denise's fiancé asked Trent about the stock market. Nobody asked me anything else. At one point, my mother stood up to refill the gravy boat and paused behind my chair just long enough to say, quietly, only to me, your cousin Melissa just got promoted to regional manager. She's 24. I didn't respond. I'd stopped expecting these comments to have a point beyond reminding me where I ranked. The dinner ended the way it always did, my mother clearing plates before anyone finished, practically snatching Trent's fork out of his hand mid-bite because she wanted the kitchen squared away before dessert. Denise and Trent trading looks I wasn't supposed to notice every time I opened my mouth, my father falling asleep in front of the football game within 20 minutes, snoring through the fourth quarter while everyone pretended not to notice. I helped with dishes because that was my role, always had been. The daughter who didn't need to be asked twice. My hands were pruned and smelled like dish soap by the time I said my goodbyes. I drove home that night with flour, still under my fingernails from the batch I'd made that morning, the radio playing something I wasn't really listening to, and I sat in my car outside my apartment for a long time before going inside. The engine ticked as it cooled. I watched my breath fog the windshield in the November air and thought about Patricia's email, still sitting there, still unanswered like a door I hadn't decided whether to walk through. That's when I finally went upstairs, opened my laptop at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd rolled out 100 batches of dough, the same table my grandmother's old rolling pin still sat on, and answered Patricia's email. I had no idea that single message would change the next 3 years of my life. I had no idea it would eventually bring my entire family to their knees, begging me for help, sitting across from me with the same fake smiles I used to give them at every holiday dinner I'd ever suffered through. I had no idea that the woman my mother once called the failure behind her back to relatives who told me about it later, thinking it would somehow motivate me, would one day be the only person capable of saving this family from complete financial ruin. But that's exactly what happened. And it started with a decision I almost didn't make. I typed back, "Yes, I'd love to talk. When works for you?" I hit send before I could talk myself out of it, my finger hovering over the trackpad for a full 10 seconds first. And I remember sitting there afterward with my heart pounding, thinking that I had just done something my family would never take seriously, something they'd probably laugh about at the next holiday dinner if I ever worked up the courage to tell them. I didn't know yet that this email was the first domino. I didn't know that within 18 months I'd be signing a contract that would make my kitchen table hobby into an actual company with a real name and a real logo, and eventually, real employees who depended on me for their paychecks. And I definitely didn't know that the same family who mocked me over turkey and cold mashed potatoes would soon need me more than I had ever needed them. 3 days later, Patricia called. Her voice was warm, direct, the kind of confidence that came from someone who'd built something real and recognized it in someone else, even through a phone line. She told me her hotel chain wanted exclusivity in their region. She told me the numbers so much bigger than anything I'd ever made in a month of markets and custom orders that I had to ask her to repeat herself. Sure, I'd misheard. She asked if I had the capacity to scale. I lied and said yes, I didn't have the capacity. I had a home kitchen, a secondhand stand mixer with a wobble in the third speed setting, and $1,100 in savings that I'd been quietly building for 2 years, dollar by dollar, tip by tip. But I said yes anyway because some part of me, the part that remembered my grandmother's hands guiding mine over a bowl of batter, the part that had spent a decade being told I was the disappointing one, knew that this was the moment. This was the fork in the road where I either stayed the family joke forever or I became something else entirely. I hung up the phone and sat perfectly still for almost a full minute before the adrenaline hit. Then I immediately started making calls. Commercial kitchen rentals in the industrial part of town. Smalls business loans, which meant filling out forms I barely understood at 11 at night with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Suppliers for flour and sugar in bulk quantities I'd never ordered before. I didn't tell my family any of it. Not because I was trying to keep secrets, but because some instinct told me they wouldn't understand, or worse, they'd find a way to make it about them. About how Trent had always known I had potential, or how Denise had encouraged me to keep at it, rewriting history the second there was something worth taking credit for. I had no idea, sitting there that night with a legal pad full of numbers I barely understood, red ink crossed out and rewritten a dozen times, that I was about to walk directly into the biggest fight of my life. Not a fight with strangers, not a fight with competitors, a fight with my own blood. Because 2 months later, when I finally told my family I'd signed a six-figure wholesale contract, sitting at my mother's kitchen table with my hands shaking, waiting for the moment I'd imagined 100 times, the moment where they'd finally see me, my mother's first response wasn't congratulations. It was, well, don't let it go to your head. I should have known then that this was only the beginning. Don't let it go to your head. The words landed like a slap, and for a second I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that escaped before I could stop it. I'd rehearsed this moment in my car on the way over. I'd pictured my mother's face lighting up, maybe even standing to hug me, my father setting down his newspaper for once and asking real questions. Instead, she wiped her hands on a dish towel and asked if I wanted coffee, like I just told her the weather forecast. Mom, I said, it's a six-figure contract, 12 hotel locations. I'm going to need a real commercial kitchen. Well, that's nice, honey, she said, opening the cabinet for mugs. Just don't quit the diner. You need something stable behind you. I didn't say anything. I sat there at that same kitchen table where I used to do homework, where she used to sign permission slips without reading them, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, like a door closing somewhere far away. My father, to his credit, at least looked up from the television long enough to say, "Good for you, kiddo," before his eyes drifted back to the game. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd gotten from my mother, and I clung to it the way you cling to any small kindness when you're starving for it. I didn't tell Denise or Trent that week. I told myself it was because I wanted to get the kitchen lease signed first, wanted something solid to point to before I opened myself up to their commentary. But if I'm honest, it was because some part of me already knew how it would go, and I wanted to protect the news for a little longer, the way you protect a candle flame with your hand in the wind. The commercial kitchen I found was in an industrial strip on the east side of town, sandwiched between an auto body shop and a place that made custom cabinets. It smelled like bleach and rubber when I first walked through it, nothing like my grandmother's kitchen, nothing like anywhere I'd ever baked before. But it had 3 ovens, actual walk-in refrigeration, and enough counter space that I nearly cried standing in the middle of it, picturing racks of cupcakes cooling in rows instead of stacked precariously on my kitchen table in the top of my refrigerator. The loan came through 2 weeks later, $22,000, which felt like both the smallest and largest number I'd ever seen attached to my name. I signed the papers with a pen that skipped twice, my signature looking shakier than I felt. Patricia sent over the formal contract the same week, and I read every line 3 times before signing, terrified I was missing something. Some clause that would let this whole thing evaporate before it started. It didn't evaporate, it was real. I had a business now. Sweetline Bakery, I called it, after a nickname my grandmother used to call me when I lined up my dolls in size order as a kid. She said I always liked things sweet and in a line, and it stuck with me my whole life, tucked away until I finally had something worth naming. I hired my first employee in March, a woman named Rosa, who'd worked in commercial kitchens for 15 years and could pipe a rose border faster than I could mix a bowl of batter. Watching her work that first week, I understood for the first time that I wasn't just a person who baked anymore. I was building something with walls and a payroll and a future that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. I finally told Denise and Trent at our mother's birthday dinner in April, 5 months after that first Thanksgiving. I'd waited long enough that the business had its first real month of profit behind it. Numbers that felt undeniable, concrete, unmockable. I thought that would matter. I was wrong. Wait, so you have, employees now? Trent asked, setting down his fork with an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between confusion and something sharper underneath it. Since when? Since January, I said. I signed a distribution deal with a hotel chain, 12 locations across 3 states. Denise exchanged a look with her fiancé, the kind of look that used to make me feel invisible and now just made me feel tired. That's random, she said. You never mentioned any of this. I'm mentioning it now. Must be nice, Trent muttered, and there it was, that edge again, thin but unmistakable, like a hairline crack in glass. I'd expected surprise. I'd expected maybe even a little pride, however grudging. What I hadn't expected was the flicker of something that looked almost like resentment, like I'd done something to him personally by succeeding at something he'd never taken seriously. My mother, predictably, redirected the conversation within 30 seconds, asking Denise about wedding venues. And the moment I'd built up in my head for 5 months dissolved into nothing, swallowed by seating charts and flower arrangements. I sat there with my untouched slice of cake and realized, maybe for the first time clearly, that my family wasn't ever going to give me the moment I wanted. If I wanted acknowledgement, I was going to have to build it myself, brick by brick, the same way I'd built everything else. So I did. By summer, Sweetline had outgrown Rosa and me. I hired 2 more bakers and a part-time delivery driver. Patricia connected me with a second regional buyer, a coffee shop chain looking for a signature pastry line, and I said yes before I even finished doing the math on whether I could handle it. I was running on adrenaline and stubbornness in equal measure, sleeping 5 hours a night, learning bookkeeping software at midnight, learning to negotiate contracts by reading every clause until the words blurred. It was around this time that Trent started asking questions that weren't really questions. So how much did you say that contract was worth? Are you doing your own taxes for this, or did you hire someone? You should be careful. A lot of small businesses fail in the first 2 years. Each comment wrapped in concern, each one landing like a small stone thrown just hard enough to sting. I didn't understand it yet, not fully. I thought it was just Trent being Trent, unable to process that his little sister might be doing something he couldn't casually dismiss anymore. I didn't yet understand that he'd started telling people at his own job that his sister ran some kind of baking startup, inflating it in conversations with coworkers while diminishing it every time he spoke to my face. I found that out much later from a coworker of his I ran into at a gas station who congratulated me on the whole Sweetline thing like it was common knowledge, like Trent had been talking about it for months. It was such a strange, disorienting feeling, realizing my brother was proud of me to strangers and dismissive of me to my face, like there were 2 different versions of my success, living in 2 different rooms of his mind, and I wasn't allowed into the one where he was proud. Denise's behavior shifted differently. She started asking me for things. Small at first. Could I make the cupcakes for her engagement party? Obviously at a discount. Obviously because it's for family, Callie. You're not going to charge your own sister full price, are you? I did it anyway. Told myself it was generosity. Told myself families should support family. But then it became the bridal shower. Then the rehearsal dinner desserts. Then, 3 weeks before her wedding, an entire dessert table for 200 guests, which she asked for like it was a foregone conclusion. Like my labor was simply a resource the family got to draw on whenever convenient. I did the math on that one. 200 guests, a full dessert table with a 5-tier cake as the centerpiece would have cost any other client close to $4,000. Denise never once mentioned paying me. When I gently brought up costs, just to see how she'd respond, she looked at me like I'd suggested something obscene. You're going to charge me? For my own wedding? Denise, this is my business. This is thousands of dollars of ingredients and labor. I can't believe you're being like this, she said, her voice climbing, drawing the attention of our mother from the next room. I thought you'd want to do this for me. My mother appeared in the doorway before I could respond, and I watched her take in the scene. Denise's face flushed, mine tight with frustration, and make her decision in about half a second, the way she always did. Callie, it's your sister's wedding, she said, like that settled everything, like the words your sister's wedding were a magic incantation that dissolved the concept of fair compensation. You're not actually going to make her pay, are you? I looked at both of them, my sister who was about to ask me to donate a small fortune in labor and materials to her wedding, my mother who thought the correct response to that request was to shame me for hesitating, and I felt something shift inside me that had been building for months, maybe years, maybe my whole life. No, I heard myself say, I won't make her pay. Relief flooded Denise's face. My mother nodded like a judge satisfied with a verdict, but I also won't be doing the dessert table, I continued. I'll help you find a bakery that can do it within your budget. But Sweetline isn't a charity, and I'm not going to run my business at a loss because it's inconvenient for people to remember it's a real company now. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I'd ever sat inside. Denise's face went from relief to disbelief to something colder, something I hadn't seen directed at me before, not like this. My mother's mouth actually fell open slightly before she caught herself. I can't believe you, Denise finally said, her voice shaking, after everything I've done for you. I wanted to ask what exactly she meant by that. I wanted to ask what she'd ever done for me besides laugh at my cupcakes across the Thanksgiving table. But I didn't say it. I just stood there feeling the ground shift beneath the family dynamic that had held its shape for 26 years, and I had no idea. Standing in that kitchen with my sister's fury radiating toward me and my mother's disapproval settling over the room like smoke, that this single moment, me simply saying no, was up to set off a chain of events that would tear the entire family apart before it ever had a chance to heal. Because 2 days later, my mother called me with a voice I'd never heard her use before, tight and strange and almost frightened, and told me that Denise's fiance had pulled out of the wedding entirely. And somehow, impossibly, everyone in the family had already decided it was my fault. My mother's voice on the phone was tight, almost trembling, in a way I'd never heard from her before. Denise's engagement is off, she said, without so much as a hello. Marcus called it off this morning. And Callie, I need you to understand how bad the timing on this looks. I remember standing in my kitchen at Sweetline, flour dusting the front of my apron, phone wedged between my shoulder and ear, genuinely confused. Timing on what? You refused to do her wedding desserts 2 days ago, and now the wedding is off. Denise is telling everyone you humiliated her in front of Marcus's mother. I actually laughed, a short, incredulous sound, before I caught myself. Mom, I never said anything to Marcus's mother. I haven't spoken to her in months. Well, that's not what Denise is saying. And there it was. The first real crack, wide enough now that I could see straight through it. I hung up the phone that day feeling something I hadn't quite felt before in relation to my family. Not hurt, not disappointment, but a kind of cold clarity. I called Denise directly, something I rarely did, needing to understand what story was circulating before it hardened into permanent family lore. She picked up on the second ring, her voice clipped. What? Denise, what happened with Marcus? Mom saying I caused this somehow. A long pause. Then quieter, almost defeated. Marcus's mother asked me last week why my own sister wouldn't help with my wedding. I told her you were being difficult, she told Marcus. He said if my family couldn't even pull together for my wedding, it worried him about what our marriage would look like, that we didn't have each other's backs. I sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of it settle into place. So you told his family I refused to give you thousands of dollars of free labor, and left out that I offered to help you find an affordable alternative. It's not that simple, Callie. It actually is that simple, I said, and for once my voice didn't shake. You made a choice to frame me as the villain instead of just admitting to your future mother-in-law that weddings are expensive and you needed a budget option. And now you're blaming me because that story blew up in your face. She hung up on me. I stood there in my kitchen holding a silent phone, and Rosa, who'd clearly overheard enough of the conversation to piece it together, just looked at me with quiet sympathy and went back to piping buttercream roses without saying a word, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. The next 3 weeks were some of the strangest of my life. My mother called almost daily, each conversation a variation on the same theme. I needed to apologize to Denise. I needed to understand how hard this was for her. I needed to consider making some kind of gesture to smooth things over, maybe offer to cater the rescheduled wedding for free after all, once Denise found a new fiancé or patched things up with Marcus. The idea that I might not be at fault for any of this never seemed to enter the conversation as a real possibility. Trent, meanwhile, went quiet in a way that felt almost more unsettling than Denise's fury. He stopped responding to texts. When I ran into him at our father's birthday lunch in June, he was polite in that distant, professional way you'd be polite to a coworker you didn't particularly like, and I understood, without anyone saying it directly, that he'd chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. It was my father, of all people, who finally said something that cut through the noise. He caught me alone in his garage after that birthday lunch, ostensibly helping me carry something to my car, and he said, in his usual understated way, "You know, none of this is really about the wedding, right?" I looked at him, surprised he was even acknowledging it. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, running a hand over his jaw the way he did when he was choosing words carefully, which wasn't often. "Your sister's been used to being the one people fuss over. Your mother's been used to you being the one who does what's asked without complaint. You changing that scares them more than the money ever did. It's not really about $4,000 of cupcakes, Callie. It's about you stopping being who they expected you to be." It was the most emotionally perceptive thing I'd ever heard my father say in 26 years, and it landed with a weight I wasn't prepared for. I didn't respond right away. I just nodded, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly, some old knot I hadn't realized I was carrying. "I'm not saying you're wrong," he added before heading back inside. "I'm just saying be ready. This isn't over." He was right. By July, Sweetline had grown enough that I moved into a larger commercial space, doubled my staff, and started supplying 2 additional regional coffee chains on top of the hotel contract. Patricia had become something between a mentor and a friend. Someone who checked in not because she needed something from me, but because she seemed to genuinely enjoy watching the business grow. I remember telling her about the wedding conflict over coffee one afternoon, half expecting her to tell me I'd been too harsh. Instead, she said, "You know, the moment you stop being the free labor in a family, some people stop knowing what to do with you. That's not a reflection of you. That's a reflection of what they valued you for in the first place." I turned that thought over for weeks. Denise eventually reconciled with Marcus in August, a small subdued ceremony that I wasn't invited to. I found out about it through a photo Aunt Carol posted online, a photo I stared at for a long time, feeling a strange mixture of relief that Denise had gotten her happy ending and hurt that I'd been erased from the narrative entirely, like I'd never existed in the story of her life at all. My mother called the week after the wedding, her voice syrupy in a way that immediately put me on guard. "Denise and Marcus are doing so well," she said. "I really think, now that things have settled down, it would mean so much if you reached out to smooth things over. Maybe send a nice gift. Something from Sweetline even. It would go a long way." I sat with the phone against my ear, staring at the ceiling of my office, my actual office now, with a desk and a filing cabinet and framed photos of my grandmother on the wall, and I felt something inside me finally, fully settle into place. Mom, I said, I'm not going to apologize for something I didn't do wrong. And I'm not going to send a gift to smooth over a story Denise made up about me to save face with her in-laws. Callie, family is about compromise. Family is supposed to be about more than me constantly compromising while everyone else gets to be upset, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I've spent my whole life being the one who apologizes first, who gives the most, who takes the hit so everyone else stays comfortable. I'm not doing that anymore. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its syrupy edge entirely, replaced by something colder, more familiar. You've changed, Callie. Success has made you selfish. No, I said quietly. Success has made me someone who finally knows her own worth. There's a difference. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat at my desk for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, feeling the particular ache of watching a relationship crack in real time and choosing not to catch the pieces. I didn't hear from my mother again for almost 2 months. I didn't hear from Denise at all. Trent sent one text in September, something non-committal about hoping the business was going well, which felt less like an olive branch and more like someone checking whether the door was still open in case he ever needed to walk through it. I threw myself into Sweetline during those months, and in some strange way, the silence from my family gave me room to grow in ways I hadn't expected. Without the emotional labor of managing everyone else's feelings about my success, I had space to actually build. I hired an operations manager. I signed a third regional contract, this one with a national grocery chain interested in a limited product line for their bakery section, a deal so large it made my hands shake when I signed it. Patricia took me to dinner to celebrate, and over dessert, not my own for once, a shared tiramisu at a restaurant she loved, she told me something I've held on to ever since. The families who can't celebrate you when you're small, she said, usually can't handle you when you're big either. It's not really about the size of your success. It's about whether they ever actually wanted you to have any. I thought about my grandmother then, about her kitchen in Ohio, about her voice telling me that baking was the one place where doing things right always paid off. No exceptions, no politics, no favorites. I wondered what she would think of all this. Of the family fractures, of the business, of the version of myself that had finally learned to say no. I like to think she'd be proud. I like to think she'd tell me I was finally living by her old rule, in my own life instead of just in my kitchen. But peace never lasts long in families like mine, and I should have known that the silence wasn't an ending. It was a held breath. Because in October, everything I thought I understood about my family's finances, about Trent's job, about the stability my mother had always held over my head like a threat. All of it turned out to be a lie so much bigger than cupcakes and wedding desserts that it would make everything before it look like a warm-up. My father called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice barely holding together, and said 4 words I never expected to hear from him in my entire life. Callie, we need help. My father's voice cracked on the phone in a way I'd never heard before. Callie, we need help. I remember gripping the edge of my desk, the office suddenly feeling very far away from the version of my family I thought I understood. Dad, what's going on? What kind of help? There was a long pause, the kind that told me whatever came next was going to reorganize everything I thought I knew. Trent's company let him go 3 months ago, he finally said. He's been telling everyone he's still working there. Your mother and I have been covering his mortgage payments since July. We took out a second loan against the house to do it. We're behind on our own bills now, Callie. The bank sent a notice this week. We might lose the house. I sat there in silence for a long moment, trying to absorb the shape of what he was telling me. Trent, who'd sat across from me at every family dinner for the past year talking about his leadership retreats and his quarterly targets, hadn't had a job since July. My parents, who'd spent my entire adult life lecturing me about stability, had quietly bankrupted themselves trying to protect an image that wasn't even true anymore. Does Denise know? I asked. No one knows. Your mother didn't want anyone to know. She's been so ashamed, Callie. You know how she is about appearances. I did know. I knew better than anyone in that family how much my mother valued the story of us over the truth of us. I'd spent 26 years being quietly written out of that story because I didn't fit the image she wanted to project, and now I was hearing that the same instinct had led her to mortgage her own home rather than admit her golden child had failed. What do you need from me, Dad? His voice dropped lower, like he was ashamed to even ask. We were hoping, given how well Sweetline is doing. We were hoping you might be able to help with a loan, just to cover the gap until we can sort out the house. Your mother didn't want me to call you. She said you'd say no after everything with Denise. But I told her I had to try. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. The same family that mocked my cupcakes, that shamed me for not doing free labor at a wedding, that let me sit through 100 comments about getting a real job, was now calling because my real job had become the family safety net they never believed I could be. But another part of me, a quieter part, just felt sad. Sad for my father, who'd clearly been carrying this alone for months. Sad for my mother, who'd rather bankrupt herself than admit a truth. And sad in a strange way for Trent, who I imagined must have been drowning in his own shame every single day, unable to say the words out loud to anyone. Let me think about it, I said. Give me a day. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept turning over every version of what saying yes or no might mean. If I said no, I risked confirming every story my family had ever told about me being cold, selfish, ungrateful for everything they'd supposedly done for me. If I said yes, I risked pouring money into a situation that had been built on months of lies, propping up a story that was never mine to fix in the first place. I called Patricia the next morning, not for business advice this time, but because she'd become the closest thing I had to someone who understood the strange new terrain I was navigating. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that stuck with me. You can help people without rescuing the lie they're living in, she said. There's a difference between generosity and enabling. Only you know which one this is. I thought about that for a long time. Then I drove to my parents' house. My mother answered the door looking smaller than I remember, the confidence she usually wore like armor noticeably absent. My father sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once told them about my six-figure contract and been told not to let it go to my head. Trent was there too, which surprised me, sitting with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. I talked to Dad, I said, sitting down across from them. I know about the job. I know about the money you've been putting into covering for him. Trent's face went through several emotions at once. Shock that I knew, humiliation that it was finally out in the open, and something that looked almost like relief, like a burden being set down after months of carrying it alone. I didn't know how to tell anyone, he said quietly. Everyone always expected so much from me. I didn't know how to say I failed. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard my brother say. For the first time, I saw him not as the golden child who'd always overshadowed me, but as someone who'd been trapped in the same family mythology I had, just on the other side of it. Terrified of falling from a pedestal instead of never having been placed on one. I'm not going to pretend this doesn't sting, I said, looking at my mother directly. You've spent telling me to be careful, to keep the diner job, to not let success go to my head, while quietly bankrupting yourselves to protect Trent's image. That's a lot to sit with. My mother's eyes filled with tears, something I'd rarely seen from her. I didn't know what else to do, Callie. I didn't want people to know he'd failed. I didn't want people to see us as anything less than what we'd always presented. That's the thing, Mom, I said gently. You were so afraid of us looking like a family that struggles, that you nearly destroyed the family trying to hide it. Real families struggle. Real families fail sometimes. Hiding it doesn't protect anyone. It just isolates everyone. I told them I'd help, but not in the way they expected. I wasn't going to hand over a loan to cover a lie that would just need covering again in 3 months. Instead, I offered to pay for one session with a financial advisor I trusted, someone who could look honestly at their entire situation. The house, the mortgage, Trent's unemployment, and build an actual plan, not a patch. I offered Trent a temporary position at Sweetline, not out of charity, but because I genuinely needed an operations assistant. He actually had relevant experience, buried under all the fabricated leadership retreats. I told them I would help pay 1 month of the mortgage gap, but only one, and only alongside the financial planning, not instead of it. It wasn't the blank check they'd hoped for, but it was real help, the kind that actually addressed the problem instead of just delaying it. My mother cried harder at the kitchen table than I'd ever seen her cry, and for the first time in my life, she reached across the table and took my hand. I'm sorry, Callie, she said. I'm sorry for how long it took me to see you. I didn't fully forgive her in that moment. I don't think forgiveness works like a switch you flip in the middle of a conversation. But something shifted between us that day, some old architecture of the family, finally cracking open enough to let in air that hadn't been there before. Trent started at Sweetline the following week, and to my genuine surprise, he was good at it. Organized, detail-oriented, humbled in a way that made him easier to work with than I ever expected. We didn't become close overnight. Some wounds don't heal on a schedule that convenient. But we started having real conversations for the first time in our adult lives. Conversations that weren't performances for our parents' approval. Denise, when she finally found out the truth about Trent's job in the mortgage, was furious at our parents for keeping it from her, and in a strange twist, that fury became the thing that finally repaired things between us. She called me in November, her voice raw. I can't believe they lied to all of us. I can't believe I gave you such a hard time about the wedding when this was going on the whole time. It wasn't a full apology, not exactly, but it was an opening, and I took it. By the following spring, almost a year and a half after that first Thanksgiving where Denise laughed at my cupcake tray, Sweetline had grown into a company with 30 employees, contracts with 2 hotel chains, a coffee chain, and a regional grocery line, and revenue that had made me, for the first time in my life, genuinely financially secure. My parents had sold their house, downsized to something smaller and more honest, something that fit their actual life instead of the one they'd been pretending to afford. Trent had found steady footing, eventually moving into a role he was actually suited for at a different company, carrying none of the shame he used to hide behind fabricated stories. We had Thanksgiving together again that year, smaller than before, quieter, more honest. I brought cupcakes again, the same recipe I'd brought that first year, the one Denise had laughed at across the table. This time, my mother was the one who reached for first, taking a bite before anyone else had even sat down. These are incredible, Callie, she said, and I could tell for the first time in my life that she actually meant it. I sat at that table, looking around at a family that had cracked open and rebuilt itself into something more honest than it had ever been, and I thought about my grandmother's kitchen in Ohio, about her voice telling me that baking was the one place where doing things right always paid off, no exceptions, no politics, no favorites. I used to think she only meant the baking. I understand now that she meant something bigger. Doing things right, showing up honestly, refusing to shrink myself for other people's comfort. That was never just a recipe for cupcakes. It was a way of living. It took my family nearly bankrupting themselves and me nearly losing them to finally understand what she'd been trying to teach me my whole life. I don't know if we'll ever be the family I imagined as a kid. The one where everyone celebrates each other without conditions attached. But we're something truer than what we were before. And for the first time in my life, I feel like I belong at that table, not because I'm quiet and accommodating, but because I finally learned to take up space in it. And somewhere I like to think my grandmother is smiling at that, flower on her hands, humming an old song without a name.